Hi, my name is Collison. I'm a management consultant. I work in the area of knowledge management, knowledge sharing, organisational learning and communities of practice, which is what I want to speak about today. Now, the seminal work on communities of practice was a book by Etienne Wenger and Bill Schneider and Richard McDermott, published in 2005. The book is called Cultivating Communities of Practice. And within that book, there's a definition which Etienne gives, which goes like this. Communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something that they do, and they learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. Now, within that definition, I think there are some really key words for the sustainability of communities of practice. And the first of those words is a passion for something that they do. I think for a community to be successful, where we're taking discretionary time from people, it's important that it's something that they are passionate about, something that really matters to them and enables them to then prioritise the time they spend. So firstly, passion is an important word. Secondly, it's important that the community relates to something that they do. They're called communities of practice as opposed to communities of interest. So it's not just that I have a passing interest in this field, it's that it's something that I do, it's my practice. And communities will take some time establishing and agreeing what is this practice which we are going to share knowledge around and learn together around. That takes me to the third important criterion for a successful community, which is that they learn how to do things better. So there is a commitment to learning, a desire to improve, and a commitment to be really curious about what's going on in the field, to learn from other members of the community and to learn from outside. So learning is an important dimension. And the final dimension, which is critical to communities, is the idea that they will interact regularly. There needs to be some kind of a rhythm or a sequence of events that community members are aware of and they can plug themselves into and feel that they belong to something. So those four words are key: passion or concern, something that they do, a shared practice, a commitment to learn and improve, and finally a desire and a commitment to meet together regularly. Now, people often ask me, is there a recipe for a successful community of practice? Is there a sequence of things I can go through in order to deliver or support or sustain a successful community? It's almost as though there's a McDonald's model, which if you follow the recipe, if you follow the sequence, you can be guaranteed 100% of the time that your community of practice will always succeed. Well, regrettably, there isn't a McDonald's model. Maybe not regrettably, but anyway, there isn't a McDonald's model. There isn't a linear sequence of things that I can take you through in order to be guaranteed a successful community. I think if we had to choose a food-related metaphor, I would be tempted to think of a paella. Because the way in which paellas are cooked is very different to the way in which fast food is created. And there's a clue there about the difference between fast food and maybe slower food, which relates more to where communities of practice fit in. So I want to take you through a sequence of events that you would go through in order to prepare a successful paella. And as we do that, I'm going to relate those to particular aspects of life leading or supporting or being a member of a community of practice. So if you learn nothing else from this short video, at least you'll learn how to cook a paella. So let me start then with the first step in a sequence for cooking a paella. The first thing you do before you go into a long process of iteration is that you prepare something. You prepare a thing called the Sofrito. The Sofrito is a flavoured oil, olive oil first of all, and then garlic, pimentos, peppers, whatever it might take, is fried up in this oil to give it a really strong flavour, and that's the flavour which will find its way ultimately into the rice and the seafood or the meat or whatever else you have with your paella. Now, the parallel for a Sofrito in the world of developing a community of practice rather than cooking a paella is a thing that we might call the community charter. So a community charter is a document which outlines the ways of working, the principles whereby a community would come together. This example comes from the World Bank, who spend a lot of time creating and supporting and sustaining communities of practice across their organisation. And they've chosen a number of categories which they feel it's important to think through before you launch a community and get an excited group into action. And the first important stage is to think about the purpose of your community. What is the unique thing which this community is focused on? Are we convinced that no other group is already looking at this, that we should just combine with them? What's in and out of scope? What is the challenge which this particular community is trying to address? Secondly, they will look at what are the conditions for membership, what are the criteria? Is there a minimum hurdle or something I need to be able to do or have achieved in order to be a member, or is it open to anybody with a level of proficiency in the practice? Are there rules of engagement about recruiting or inviting other members into the community? Is it an open or closed community? Is it an invitation-only community? So that's something that will be discussed. Thirdly, are there any particular roles which are critical to the success of the community? So in the World Bank, they will have usually a sponsor, somebody at a senior level who will provide a little bit of air cover and certainly some public and private support for the community, and the fact that it meets together, they'll provide the positive reinforcement to ensure that that happens. They'll certainly have people responsible for leading or facilitating the community, usually more than one person. There may be people who are subject matter experts who will be given specific roles for managing content or identifying interesting areas for discussion. And there may, in some cases, be some kind of admin support if the community is active in terms of supporting and enabling conferences and face-to-face events and retreats. Next, perhaps most importantly of all, there'll be some agreement as to what is the way in which we will treat each other. What will it feel like to be a part of this community? I'm sure you've all been in meetings where somebody starts by facilitating and saying, let's agree some ground rules for how we're going to treat each other. And the same is true for communities of practice. It's really good to agree what happens, what are my expectations if I have a particular issue and I share it as a need in the community and nothing happens for a week. Is that normal? Or should I expect someone to at least acknowledge that I've made a request for help? Are there such things as dumb questions? What happens if I ask a question when somebody else answered it the day before and put it into some electronic discussion forum? Is that okay? Or should I be always checking before I ask a question? So agreeing what the behaviours that will make the community thrive is important. Next stage will be resources. In the World Bank, there's some small amount of budget to support communities of practice. It could maybe provide some funding for a face-to-face launch event. It could be funding to buy one member of the community who's in a particular part of the world access to an iPad or some other technology that enables them to participate. And it could be funding for software for the community overall, perhaps to meet together. Then there'll be some discussion about, are there some key topics, some things that we as a community need to particularly focus on within our overall domain, within our practice. There are some topics which we need. When something comes along, a piece of content, a question, a lesson learned, or a great example, we need to pay specific attention to collecting and curating those for the future. Ways of working and tools is important. So what's the rhythm of meetings and events look like? Will there be a newsletter? Will we have webinars or telephone conferences? Will we have some kind of a WhatsApp group? Will we meet face-to-face? Will there be some kind of a retreat together? So what is the rhythm of events? What's that look like as a potential menu of things that I can choose to subscribe to and get involved with? And finally, what are the measures of success? What does good look like? Do we have any shared KPIs or shared outcomes, or is this a community whereby individual members will derive their own success? But maybe every now and then we want to poll for success stories and examples of where the community has been useful. So a community of practice charter is a useful artifact, a useful document to create together, maybe at one of your first meetings as a community, to agree how you might work together and what your modus operandi might be. So the community of practice will have a charter, and that's a bit like the Sofrito, which gives the flavour to everything it does beyond that. So moving on from the Sofrito, the next thing that's important and distinctive about paellas, and when you cook them, is the particular way in which you apply the heat. If you're a professional paella chef, I'm sure some of you are, you'll have a paella burner that looks a bit like this, and it's designed to share out, to spread the heat out and prevent the rice and everything else getting stuck to the base of the paella pan. And in the sense of a community of practice, this is all about sharing the leadership role, not allowing one person to feel exhausted and overwhelmed and overburdened with the responsibility for leading a community, but having a group of maybe 3 or 4 people who share that responsibility, a core group of leaders who rotate in and out and who also just share the responsibility for seeing what's going on, responding for questions to newcomers, welcoming people in. So find a way to share out the heat of leadership if you're thinking about setting up a community of practice. The next thing for us to consider is what you might consider to be the staple component of a piler, which of course is the rice. And if you're a piler expert, you'll know that the rice they use is a particularly special rice, either Calspara rice or bomba rice, which is designed to withstand the longer cooking periods without dissolving away and giving you some kind of a sludge. So what's the equivalent of the rice for our communities of practice? Well, I think it's actually the content which individual members have already. Maybe they have it on their hard drives, on memory sticks, the good documents that you know, if I ever go to another job, I'm going to take that with me because it's a great example, it's a great template, it's a great role profile, it's a great bit of software, a great Excel tool, whatever it might be, those things that we store up for ourselves for the future. Why not at your first community of practice meeting have a bit of an amnesty or a bring and buy sale, whatever you want to call it, where everybody brings their best content and offers it up to their colleagues with a description as to what it is and why they might use it or when they might use it. And very quickly you'll build up a library of useful artifacts and documents that can be shared and reused. So the content is our equivalent of rice. It forms a great basis and enables the community to feel that they've done something fairly quickly, and also enables members of the community to feel they've already given something for themselves, which creates more of a marketplace dynamic, thereby they're more likely to make a request to the community later. So encourage members to bring their content. Next we move on to the critical component of a piler, at least critical if you're not a vegetarian, which is some form of meat or seafood. And for a community of practice, I believe it's important that somewhere fairly early in the development of the community, there is a meaty improvement issue or a challenge which the organisation of one of the members is facing, which somebody can bring to the community and say, hey, this is keeping me awake at night. Has anybody got an experience, a parallel situation that they could share that would help me with this particular challenge? So encourage somebody to share openly a challenge so that other people can quickly contribute to that. And there's a real sense that our community of practice is more than just a talking shop. It's a community where things actually do get resolved and people find useful solutions and ideas from other members. And sometimes taking that first step is the critical thing. So encourage people, if you're aware, if you're leading a community and you know someone's got an issue, encourage them to make that request of their fellow community members. That's the meat of a community. Now, paellas have a distinctive look and a distinctive flavour that comes from saffron or pimentos usually to provide something that's a little bit spicy and that stops it from being a bland ricey dish. Now, what's our equivalent? When a community of practice has been in existence for maybe a little while, there are moments when it can feel a little bit stale. It goes a bit bland, a bit quiet. So what can you do to spice up, to stimulate that community? What are some of the little tactics that maybe will throw a spotlight on an individual member of the community? Maybe having what they call a hot seat. So for 24 hours, one member of the community is made available to respond to questions. They're introduced to the community, and you've got 24 hours to ask Matthew anything you wanted to about his particular field of expertise. One of the ways in which communities of practice can continuously reinvigorate themselves, and one of the key words that we looked at in the definition in the first place, is the idea of learning. So what are some of the mechanisms whereby a community of practice can learn, and by doing so stimulate more conversations, more discussions, more fresh thinking, more curiosity within its members? And this model comes from another book which Etienne Wenger and Nancy White and John Smith wrote in 2009. The book is called Digital Habitats, and it's a book about how communities of practice engage with technology, but the principles here actually apply to communities who meet face to face as well. And what Wenger, White and Smith have done is identify a number of different modes of learning, different ways in which communities can learn. And they've arranged it in what I would describe something like a compass form. So we've got north, south, east and west. And from the north-south axis, they're looking at the level of formality of learning. So in the north area of this particular map, there are very informal learning dynamics. So exploring an idea, someone broadcasts an inquiry or a request for help, someone starts a discussion around a hot topic, someone submits pointers to a resource that might be external. So very informal, ad hoc learning. On the south part of this particular model, the learning is more formal. It may be an agreement to benchmark each other, or some formal training or workshop, some other way of formally transferring good practice. Maybe it's creating a model of practice, or warranting or certifying a particular standard of work. So there's a much more formal end of learning at this end of the landscape. And then if we look at the east to west axis, on the west side, we have learning from. So somebody has an experience or a piece of knowledge or a challenge maybe, and the principle is that we are learning from that person, or learning from that organization, or learning from that experience. And we might do that by attending a project review with them. We might have them share a document with us that has worked for them. We might go and visit them or participate in some kind of a peer assist perhaps with them. And then on the east side of our landscape finally, we have learning with. So in this situation, there is no individual with core knowledge that we're learning from. This is a learning journey together. We go together, we learn from. Maybe there's a recent paper or book that's come out, and we agree to create a reading group. And every month we might regroup digitally or over the phone to share what have we learned from our reading over the last few weeks. There may be other formal joint responses, running a learning project together, working on a particular innovation challenge together. So there are a number of ways in which we can do learning with each other. And the final part of the model, which Etienne, Nancy and John put together, is this idea that learning can happen beyond the boundaries of the community itself. So you may go on a field trip or invite a guest into the community, maybe a guest speaker, or you may take your internal models of practice and use them to benchmark externally. So you get some maybe challenging input from different kinds of organizations. So I've always found this quite a useful model to engage a community of practice in a discussion that says, look, here are some interesting ways in which we could learn as a community. Which ones do you think we should be looking at? That takes us on now to the next stage of cooking a piler, which is a good piler chef will regularly take the temperature of the piler. They want to make sure that nothing's getting stuck. They'll certainly want to make sure that no one's going to get food poisoning. So there'll be some regular temperature checking and stirring of the content. Now, in the world of communities of practice, of course, taking the temperature is all about getting feedback, soliciting feedback from your members, informally, face-to-face, on the phone, even possibly through surveys, even maybe more analytically through organizational or social network analysis tools, which enable you to actually visualize the way in which knowledge is flowing, the way in which questions are asked and answered, who are the real go-to people within the community, who are some of the bridges or connectors who are critical. And that can actually help you surface potential future leaders or coordinators as well. But it's important to in some way get some feedback at regular intervals. Is the community meeting the needs of its members? What would need to be different in order for it to be even more value adding? And as part of that process, what you might do is to solicit examples of where a community has been valuable to a member, get some success stories through that. Most pilers look attractive. They've been deliberately arranged to make access to the good stuff really easy. And for a community of practice, they'll usually have some kind of a portal or a website, a digital space, digital home, where I can go and access various resources, some of those good practice documents and examples. I can plug myself into discussions and maybe take a look at what other people are saying. And it's important that that space is managed well. And it's important that ideally it contains a number of success stories, things that will give me a sense that the community actually is definitely adding value, and maybe give me a story which I could share with my own senior management, perhaps, who might be saying, you know, what's this about? Why are you spending time on this one? If I have a good example from somebody else that this is how it added value for them, that can be valuable to me. Now, one way of soliciting stories is by using some kind of a recognition scheme. One of the best examples that I've come across of recognition schemes for communities of practice comes from Syngenta. They're an agrochemicals business, and they have been running with communities of practice for around about 8 years now. And periodically, I think it's every quarter, they have a call for stories, and they solicit the stories by providing awards, and they call them the Tree Awards. And the Tree Awards are designed to recognise 4 different kinds of knowledge sharing behaviours, and they spell out the word tree, and with Syngenta being an agrochemicals business, it kind of fits their model nicely. So the 4 award categories are the T, which stands for the Transfer Award. If I have transferred knowledge or learning or experience to somebody else within the community of practice, and they found that valuable and maybe delivered some kind of value or improvement through it, then I may be eligible, or my team may be eligible, for the Transfer Award. Then the R stands for the Reuse Award. So reusing somebody else's knowledge, experience, lesson learned, with accreditation, of course, with acknowledgement. But if I've reused knowledge, if I've been curious enough to look outside and ask the community for help, if I've overcome that sense of not invented here, that I'm different and I have unique problems, and been willing to ask for help and reuse that and found it useful, then I may be eligible for the reusable, particularly if I have a story or an example of where it's been value created. The E stands for embedding knowledge in a product or a process. So maybe I've curated some relevant content on behalf of the community. Maybe I've provided a webinar of my experience for the rest of the community to benefit from, that's available in perpetuity for somebody else to watch later on. And the final E of the word tree, which is slightly more tenuous, but it was hard work to spell out the word completely, is the Experience Award, or to give it its full name, the Share a Difficult Experience Award, which is given to somebody in the community who shared a failure or a problem that they've had, something that's gone wrong. And they're willing to be open about that with the community, say, whatever you do, if you encounter this kind of situation, just don't make the mistake that I made. And those awards are celebrated too. Syngenta give out about 30 of these awards every quarter, 100 or so, 120 a year, and they've been doing it for 8 years. So you can do the maths on how many success stories they have in their knowledge base that demonstrates the value which communities of practice can have. And each of those stories comes with a document or an artifact or something I can potentially reuse. So having those stories available within the community of practice, easily visible, easily accessible, is the next stage. And finally, one of the distinctive features of a paella is that it's not fast food. They take a while to cook. Generally, you wouldn't just microwave a paella. It wouldn't be the best paella, certainly if you tried to do that. There's usually somebody stirring, tasting, checking, and it can take a while. And sometimes there is a misunderstanding that communities of practice are quick fixes, that within a couple of weeks there'll be a whole flow of success stories and examples of where it's created value. I would say in my experience that is rare. It may well take 6 months before your community of practice has developed the levels of trust and relationship confidence that there are those regular stories and examples. So don't expect an overnight success, and manage expectations of people who are joining the community or sponsors who are potentially funding or supporting it. I would say give it 6 months to a year before you go looking for particular stories for your community of practice. And if we look at the overall life cycle of a community of practice, we can see these stages of planning, agreeing whether our community is sort of a go or a no-go, and that's where maybe a small number of people thinking about some of those criterion from the charter might be important. That's about cooking up the Sofrito. And then you might have a launch event where you do gather the initial interested group of potential members, and maybe together, collectively, you work through the detail of that charter and co-create what that looks like. I often work with groups where they take one topic from the charter and put them on a flip chart around the room and have a carousel-based approach whereby people go around on post-it notes adding, what do we think about purpose? What do we think about membership? What do we think about ways of working? So that within an hour or so, you've got a collective view on what that charter might look like. So some kind of a launch event, and maybe also at that launch event, you might ask people to bring their best content or their best examples or their favorite books or journals that they found really useful. So you've got some content, you've got the rice going in. You might even, in an early stage, encourage somebody to bring a particular challenge. So you've got some meat involved as well at an early stage. And then over time, you might start arranging and presenting the content and the discussions and celebrating some of those successes. You might find it's necessary at the level of building momentum and sustaining that you need to introduce some kind of activity, a learning activity, perhaps to spice things up a bit. So think about that model that we looked at earlier from Wenger, White and Smith. And then you go around and potentially take the temperature, how are people doing, what do we need to do, and maybe you then look to share out the heat in a different way. Maybe you rotate in a new leader to provide some fresh blood. So maybe you might have a 1-year tenure as a community leader and then invite other people to do that. Some organisations have elections even for their community members. So find a model that works for you, but ensure that people aren't burning out. So really, successful community leadership is about going around those sequences of bringing content, solving issues, arranging, spicing up, taking the temperature, getting feedback, sustaining, changing the leadership if you need to. Until there may come a point, perhaps, when you say, actually, the world has changed, or maybe our work here is done, or maybe there's a different focus now for members of the community. So you sunset or redirect the community into a different place. So that's an example of the life cycle of a community of practice. So I hope that's been a helpful overview of the life and sustaining of communities of practice and some tactics and tools and techniques that you might employ if you're responsible for leading or sustaining a community.